Kim. All right, we're back on. It is Saturday, September 24th, and it is 2022. And this is a significant day because this is the Saturday before Rosh Hashanah. Tomorrow at sundown is Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish civil New Year. Rosh Hashanah, literally the head of the year for Hebrew speakers. It's also known as Yom Teruah, or the Day of the Trumpets, for the religious Jews. It is a significant day because it is the first of the 3 fall feasts, which are the final 3 of the 7 appointed feasts of God for the nation of Israel, which you see me having laid out here on the chart. And the last teaching we did on one of the feasts was our teaching on the Day of Pentecost, which we did last June. And remember, I pointed out that there will be a long growing season and that the Feast of Israel are a type or a shadow or a picture of the entire prophetic plan for God and the human race. And we see that we are drawing close to the final 3 fall feasts. And Kim, if you could come here for a second and untangle me. I'm tied up. My microphone is tied up. And if you could untangle me. Kimberly here is sort of the Vanna White of South Beach Gospel Ministries, and she's helping me become untangled. But we got 7 feasts of Israel, right? And the 7 feasts of Israel will be, you can't get it?
Maybe unclick
okay.
that.
All right, so that's okay. I'll get it. The 7 feasts of Israel are going to culminate with the Day of Tabernacles. And the Day of Tabernacles will be, okay, here we are.
Just eat it.
All right.
You're good.
All right, the Day of Tabernacles will be the equivalent of what? It'll be the equivalent of the millennial reign of Christ. So, again, tomorrow sundown, Rosh Hashanah, or Yom Teruah, the Day of the Trumpets. Is it a type, picture, or shadow of the rapture of the church? And that is what we're going to be looking at. But we're also going to look at the fact that last week we were able to be witness to Bible prophecy being fulfilled to the extent that 5 red heifers, which is a red cow or a cow with red hair that has never given birth and never had sexual relations, a heifer, a female cow that has never given birth, never been involved in sexual relations, has not existed on the planet Earth for the last 2,000 years until last week. A Texan farmer who's an evangelical Christian was able to successfully breed a cow that has all red hair. And if you recall back from the Bible, we're going to take a look at the scriptures related to that. To cleanse the temple, you had to have a red heifer that was ritualistically pure, meaning that it could only have 3 or fewer white hairs. If you had a cow that had all red hair except 4, and 4 hairs were white, it was ritualistically unclean. So you've got 5 of them that were sent over to Israel. Now this born-again Christian farmer guy has been breeding cows for a while, and he eventually was able to successfully do it. But we can see supernatural events occurring because here in the United States, the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, when you breed cows, they send an inspector over, and once they inspect the cow, they put a little clip in the ear to identify it as cow number whatever for health purposes. But if you put a hole in the ear of a red cow, then that cow would be, or that red heifer would be ritualistically impure because it would have a defect. So you couldn't use it in the temple in the Bible. What happened is in 2020, COVID hit. And because COVID hit, the government workers that worked for the federal government were all sent home. And so the inspectors that were supposed to come and punch a hole and put a tag on the ear of the little baby red cows that were just born in Texas never showed up. So when the farmer, who was an evangelical Christian, is doing this because he believes God told him to do it, sent the cows to Israel, and they arrived last week, 5 of them. They didn't have the hole in the ear that the Department of Agriculture here in the United States was supposed to stamp on their ear. So they are now ritualistically pure for purposes of what? for purposes of cleansing the temple. And we're going to look at the scriptures that support that. So here we have a teaching today. We're calling today's teaching Red Heifers, Rosh Hashanah, and the Rapture. 3 important topics, all related to Bible prophecy, all being fulfilled in real time as we sit here today. So let's jump in the scriptures real quick and try to run through this in the time that we have. Here we go. We're going to start out with Numbers chapter, and we don't start out a lot in the book of Numbers, but we're going to take a look at Numbers chapter 19 today, and that's where we get information related to the red heifer. And again, we just saw this prophecy being fulfilled last week when a ritualistically pure red heifer, meaning it has 3 or fewer white hairs on the course of its entire body, were delivered to the land of Israel in anticipation, unspoken though it may be, for the rebuilding of the temple, which must be in place before the Antichrist can come in and defile it, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and before Jesus can come and cleanse that temple, Zechariah chapter 13 and 14, the temple has to be rebuilt. But if the temple's rebuilt, it can't be used unless the ashes of the red heifer are used to cleanse the temple and make it ritualistically pure. But there hasn't been a red heifer in existence on earth for the last 2,000 years, since the second temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD when Titus Vespasian, the Roman general, invaded Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and razed it to the ground. Okay, let's take a look in Numbers chapter 19, written about 1,500 years, oh, maybe even more, 2,000 years before Jesus. Numbers chapter 19, one of the 5 books of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Tanakh as the Jews call it. And it says, Numbers chapter 19, verse 1. And the Lord spake unto Moses and said unto Aaron, saying, This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord hath commanded, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they bring thee a red heifer without spot, wherein there is no blemish, and upon which never came a yoke. And ye shall give her unto Eleazar the priest, that he may bring her forth without the camp, outside the camp. Got to take the red heifer outside the camp. And one shall slay her before his face. Jesus is a type of the red heifer. The red heifer is a type of Jesus. The red of the hair is symbolic of the blood that had to be shed at Calvary. That Jesus was taken outside the city of Jerusalem to be crucified on Calvary is foreshadowed 2,000 years earlier in the book of Numbers, when you take the red heifer outside the camp and slay it, so that the blood shed can make the temple pure. And so it goes on to say, And Eleazar the priest shall take of her blood, this is starting at verse 4, with his finger, and sprinkle her blood directly before the tabernacle of the congregation 7 times. That was the substitute for the temple before the permanent temple is built. And one shall burn the heifer in his sight, in the sight of the priest, who's acting sort of as God. And her skin and her flesh and her blood with her dung shall he burn. And the priest shall take the cedar wood and the hyssop and the scarlet and cast it into the midst of the burning of the heifer. And then the priest shall wash his clothes, and he shall bathe his flesh in water. And afterward he shall come into the camp, and the priest shall be unclean until the evening. And then he that burneth her shall wash his clothes in the water, and bathe his flesh in the water, and shall be unclean until the evening. And a man that is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer, and lay them up without or outside the camp, in a clean place, and it shall be kept for the congregation of the children of Israel, for a water of separation. It is a purification for sin. And then in verse 10 it says, And he that gathereth the ashes of the heifer shall wash his clothes and be unclean until the evening, and it shall be unto the children of Israel and unto the stranger that sojourneth among them for a statute forever. And so what the priest would do is take the ashes of this red heifer that was burned after it had been ritualistically slain outside the camp, and the ashes would be mingled with water, and the water would be sprinkled into the temple, and that water of the ashes of the red heifer would be used to ritualistically purify the temple so that sacrifices could be made. So if the nation of Israel rebuilds a temple, and we know that the Temple Institute in Jerusalem is already in existence, and that the implements are already prepared, And the superstructure is already in readiness in various parts in the land of Israel in hiding, so that if they chose to, the temple could be rebuilt in as little as 6 months. 6 months from today, you could have a fully operational temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem if the political climate would allow for it. Physically, it would not be a problem. The only problem is there hasn't been a red heifer for 2,000 years until an evangelical Christian from Texas delivered last week 5 red heifers to the land of Israel for the very specific purpose of ritualistically cleansing the temple should it be rebuilt in the next 6 months. We have red heifers that once they reach the appropriate age could be slain and then burned, and then their ashes sprinkled in water, and then the water sprinkled in the temple to cleanse it and make it open for operation. And we know that that has to happen. Why? Because we know from the Bible that the Antichrist will come into the temple and stop the oblation and the sacrifice. We know that from Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Antichrist will, after 3.5 years of making a 7-year peace treaty, halfway through that peace treaty, and Kimberly, come over here for a second if you could, and hold this up for me. Okay, so what we see is that Daniel chapter 9, verse 27 tells us that the temple has to be rebuilt because Antichrist is going to confirm a covenant after the rapture of the church, which we're going to address. And for 7 years, a 1 week of years period of time, there's going to be a peace treaty that allows the temple to be rebuilt. But midway through that 7-year period of time, or 3.5 years into it, he will go into the temple, and Paul tells us in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, he's going to desecrate the temple by claiming to be God and the Messiah all at one time. So the temple absolutely has to be fulfilled for 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, to be literally fulfilled. There has to be a temple. But for there to be a temple, there has to be a red heifer, which hasn't existed for 2,000 years until last week. They arrived in Israel. So now is the time. Within the next 6 months, you could have a temple standing. And once you burn those red heifers and sprinkle their ashes in water, you could ritualistically make the temple open and operating for business, just like it was at the time of Jesus. So, this is, again, as I said, a especially important time in Bible prophecy based upon what happened last week in the land of Israel. And we had our friend Ben, Jewish believer, born in Jerusalem, and his video would be up on our YouTube page. For those of you that haven't yet, like and subscribe to our YouTube page, South Beach Gospel Ministries, and you can see Jerusalem Ben's testimony about what he believes about the Messiah, what he thinks of rebuilding the temple, and what he thinks about the red heifers and Bible prophecy being fulfilled. Those videos will be available at around the same time today when we upload them to our YouTube page. So, like and subscribe if you haven't, and welcome to all of our new subscribers. We got a bunch of them. But now let's go ahead and jump over. We talked about the red heifers, but we also talked about the fact that today is the first of the final 3 fall feasts of God for Israel. And again, this particular feast of God of the 7 is probably the very best type or shadow or picture of the rapture of the church of all 7. Pentecost was an interesting one, but all 7 of them, I think Feast of Trumpets is the one that is the best. There's a series of trumpet blasts that occur over the course of this 2-day period of time, and it's based upon the appearing of a sliver moon in the sky. So nobody knows the exact time that the Feast of Trumpets or the Day of the Trumpets will begin, but it's supposed to be a time of harvest, a time of celebration, because the long summer growing season has come to a close, and now you harvest in all the fruit of your labor. So the farmers would start in the springtime and plant the early seed, and then they'd get the early harvest in the springtime, and they'd make an offering of the first fruits to the Lord, and in anticipation of planting throughout the rest of the spring, so that during the long summer growing season, when it's hot and uncomfortable out, at the end of that long summer growing season would be the time of the harvest, when the fruits of your labor could be enjoyed, and there would be a trumpet blasted just as the sliver moon appears, and everybody would know, hey, come out of the fields and stop doing work, stop harvesting. The harvest is over. Everything that's been brought in is now in, and now you celebrate the abundance that you've amassed during the time of harvest for the long winter that's coming, and so now you can rest from your labors. It's a type or a picture or a shadow of the people of the planet Earth laboring outside the presence of the Lord. But when the rapture of the church occurs, we can now, and Kim says, I want it now, you know, Messiah now. Like that, right. We're out here passing out tracts, and Kim is saying, well, I'm kind of like a Jewish farmer out planting seeds. I'm planting the seeds of the gospel of Jesus Christ in these chick tracts, and it's hot out, and man, it's uncomfortable sometimes. And Steve, you know, when in his years out here, he would say the same thing. But there's coming a time, and maybe this weekend, you know, goodness forbid, when the last trump blasts, the last trumpet of this year's Rosh Hashanah or Yom Teruah will occur somewhere around the time of noon Eastern Standard Time. And here in Miami, 12 noon on Tuesday, also around 12 noon in New York City. Here on the east coast of the United States of America, it'll be a different time in the land of Israel and Jerusalem, but it'll be about Tuesday at noon here in Miami, Florida, Miami Beach, Florida, New York City along the east coast of the United States. About noonish on Tuesday will be the final trumpet blast of the several trumpet blasts of the two-day feast known as Yom Teruah, or the Feast of the Trumpets. Let's go through the Feast of the Lord for Israel really quickly. Leviticus chapter 23 is where we find the information related to the first of the feasts, Passover, which was a type of the crucifixion of Jesus for the people. He comes as the Passover lamb. That's followed quickly by the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is, you know, the next day, this feast that you eat the Passover lamb that was slain. And then that's a type of becoming born again by partaking of Jesus' death on the cross, by becoming born again. Then you come to the next, or the third of the feast, which occurs over the course of the next 2 to 6 days, which is the Feast of First Fruits, which occurs several days after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it is a type or shadow or picture of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead 3 days later, 3 days after the Passover sacrifice. Jesus rises from the dead so that he is the first fruits of them that are going to be permanently resurrected from the dead. Kim and I, you know, we're part of the church, so if we die before the rapture, we're going to be permanently resurrected from the dead. Smith gave his testimony a little bit earlier. I'll also upload that to YouTube later today, where he said he was medically ill and he was dying, and he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord gave him supernatural healing. But if he had died, he would eventually be resurrected from the dead permanently. But the very first person to be permanently resurrected from the dead is none other than Jesus of Nazareth. And that is a type or shadow or picture of the Feast of First Fruits. And then after that, you got 50 days later, you have the Feast of Weeks, which is the 50-day period between the Feast of First Fruits and the day of Pentecost. 49 days after the Feast of First Fruits gives you the 50th day, which is called the Feast of Pentecost. And the Feast of Pentecost is also the day, the feast, that period of time is also in Hebrew known as Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. 7 weeks, meaning 49 days, plus the next day gives you 50 days, and that 50th day is the day of Penta, which is our Greek word for 50, Pentecost. So Pentecost was a Jewish feast that was celebrated at the time of Jesus, but it also is the day that the Holy Spirit was sent from heaven to indwell the followers of Jesus Christ who had just resurrected from the dead some 50 days earlier. So the very first Pentecost after the crucifixion of Jesus was the day that the church was officially born. The birthday of the church was feast number 4, the Feast of Pentecost, which we taught about last June. We talked about how that was a type or a shadow or a picture possibly of the rapture. But the best of the pictures of the rapture of the 7 feasts is the very next one. After the long growing season, so you have the 50th day after the resurrection from the dead, or the 50th day after first fruits, you have 135 days till you get to the first of the fall feast, the high feast of the Lord, which is Feast of Trumpets, Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, when God himself will dwell with his people. We are now at number 5, or we will be tomorrow at sundown. Feast number 5, Yom Teruah, also known by the secular name Rosh Hashanah, head of the year. The Jewish year begins in the springtime for religious Jews. The secular year for Jews begins in the fall time, and Rosh Hashanah acknowledges that. So let's go ahead and take a look at Leviticus chapter 23. And what we find out in verse 23 of Leviticus 23, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, in the first day of the month, and that's for us is the equivalent of September into October on our Gregorian Roman calendar, the fall time. In the 7th month, the first day of the month, shall ye have a Sabbath, a memorial of blowing of the trumpets, and holy convocation, and ye shall do no servile work therein, but ye shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. And we know in times past we've talked about how there are two different goats or sheep that are offered. One is the scapegoat. The priest lays the hands on the goat and lets it go into the wilderness to die. That's kind of the symbolic act of the priest transferring the sins of the people from one goat that's accepted and is sacrificed in the temple, and transferring those sins of the nation of Israel for that year to the scapegoat who's sent out into the wilderness outside the camp to die for the sins of the people. Again, it's another type, picture, or shadow of the death of Jesus Christ on the cross outside the city of Jerusalem, outside the temple, outside the camp, of which the red heifer is a type or a shadow or a picture of. The red being the blood of Jesus shed at Calvary, killing that particular red heifer outside the camp, and then using his ashes from his body to purify the temple and everyone who comes into the temple precincts. Again, so we are now, again, as I said, number 5 of the 7 feasts. Feast of Trumpets, Yom Teruah, a very important feast. After those lambs are sacrificed and the scapegoat goes out into the wilderness, you would hear a series of blasts of horns over the course of the 2 days. And again, because you never knew exactly when the sliver moon would appear in the sky, you couldn't tell the exact moment or hour, but you would know the general time frame. And is that not what Jesus taught and Paul taught about the pre-tribulation rapture of the church? No man knoweth the day or the hour, but Jesus condemned those that didn't know the seasons. He said the sailors can look at the sky and say, take warning, the sky is red and glowering, oh my gosh, there's going to be a storm. When a hurricane is approaching, you can look out your window and say, oh my gosh, a hurricane's approaching. In the Midwest, tornadoes moved a little bit faster, but you could always tell before a tornado would hit in the Midwest in Michigan where I grew up, because the sky would turn green. The sky, it would become deadly silent. Even the crickets wouldn't chirp anymore, and the sky would turn green, literally like pea soup. And about 10 or 15 minutes after that, all heck would break loose. So you could tell by looking at the sky when the storm was coming, and you could predict it pretty much within a few minutes of it occurring. You couldn't tell the exact minute that it was going to break loose. You couldn't tell the exact moment in time when that would occur, but you could get the general time frame right. And that's the same type, picture, or shadow that Jesus used to describe the pre-tribulation rapture. No man knows the day or the hour, but doggone it, he criticized the Pharisees for not being alert enough to look at the sign of the times and tell that this is the time of the Messiah. I'm going to be the guy that's going to be the Passover lamb. How are you missing out on that point? And the same is true for us in the church. We see that the red heifer that has not existed on the planet Earth for 2,000 years has now supernaturally within the last few days appeared in the land of Israel without a defect that should have been imposed by the United States Department of Agriculture on the little baby cows as a way to mark or keep track of them. But because of a worldwide pandemic, the COVID crisis, they weren't able to do their job. Was that a supernatural occurrence allowed by God? What Satan intended for our evil, God intended for our good and for the good of the nation of Israel and for the rebuilding of the temple? Certainly we know that the temple has to be restanding at the time of the Antichrist for the Antichrist to go into the temple and to desecrate it. So it's a bad thing. But we also know too that 1,260 days after Antichrist goes into the temple and desecrates it by calling himself God in human flesh, Jesus himself will come back 1,260 days later, kick out the Antichrist, kill him, and then fulfill the prophecies of Zechariah chapter 13 and 14 when the Messiah, the King of Israel, will take the throne of David, enter into the temple, and bring a 1,000-year period of time of peace, which is typified by Feast of Israel number 6, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, followed by feast number 7, the final of the 7 feasts, tabernacles, when God himself dwelled with Israel in the wilderness. It was called Sukkot because they built booths and dwelt in the wilderness, and God came into the camp and dwelt with them. So that is a type or a shadow or picture of what Jesus does at the end of that 7-year period of time, 3.5 years after which Antichrist goes into the temple, which has to be rebuilt and quite possibly will be within the next few months, if not the next few years. To go into and defile it triggers the last 1260 days until Jesus comes back, God bless you, to the earth to set up the millennial reign of Christ, the Messianic era, the reestablishment of the throne of David, which has fallen down, it says in the Old Testament, will be restored again by the presence physically of Jesus Christ on the earth. And so we are approaching what could possibly be the very last Yom Teruah or Rosh Hashanah prior to the pre-tribulation rapture church. Now, if God was not only using Rosh Hashanah or Yom Teruah as a type or shadow, a picture of the pre-tribulation rapture, and he actually chose a feast to have it occur on. Now, some people say it's too obvious, so it wouldn't happen on that day, but because God knows that everybody thinks it's too obvious, so it's not going to happen on Rosh Hashanah. Maybe he's going to make it happen on Rosh Hashanah because nobody's expecting it to, because it would be too obvious for the rapture to occur on Rosh Hashanah. So if you were going to pick one of the 7 feasts to have the rapture occur on, certainly Rosh Hashanah or Yom Teruah would be the type, picture, or shadow that best fits the pre-tribulation rapture. No man knows the day or the hour, but we can know the general time frame. And I said tomorrow at about sundown, Rosh Hashanah will begin. And then there are going to be a series of trumpet blasts that will be blasted in the land of Israel to signal the end of the long, hot summer growing season when all the farmers had to work hard and plant their seed. Now you have a period of time, you can harvest in all the stuff that got grown during the long growing season, dating all the way back to the springtime. And so you would gather those grain into the harvest place, into the storehouse, and when the final trumpet blast occurred, the guys that were out in the field harvesting, like Kim is right now, Kim's out handing out gospel tracts to all these people. Kim is a type or a shadow or a picture, and we can see her on video on one of our other videos today. You can look and see her actually handing out the tracts. That is a picture or a shadow of the workers in the land of Israel going out and harvesting the grain in before the final trumpet blast. So you get, we got another, here comes another bushel of grain, fruit of our labors over the long growing season. And what we're doing is harvesting souls into the kingdom of Jesus Christ by passing out gospel tracts and sharing the gospel with people. And the people who get saved are our harvest. But it's not easy work. It's hot out today. Gosh darn it, man. It's summertime, or it feels like summertime here in Miami Beach. It may be nice and relaxing and comfortable in Michigan or wherever else in the world you are. Our friends in Australia, I don't know what the weather is like right there. But right here today, it's super hot, even though we're here at the end of the fall or the end of September. But there's coming a period of time when the harvesting will end, when the final trumpet blast occurs, which this year will occur, as I said, about noon on Tuesday, Miami Eastern Standard Time, or New York City Eastern Standard Time in the United States. At about noonish, we don't know for sure exactly when that sliver moon will appear in the sky in Jerusalem, but we know that at that point in time, according to the feast of Yom Teruah, the final trumpet blast, the long one, and then that means no more harvesting. That's it. The harvest is over. Now we come in and enjoy the fruits of our labor. That means, Kim, no more tract passing. Stop passing out tracts. Time to come into the Father's house where it's air conditioned and there's comfort and there's food and there's joy and there's happiness. And Kim's like, oh man, are you serious? I don't have to work anymore? She's doing a happy dance right here because she wants that final, because why? Because she's working hard. And she's working hard, why? Because she knows time is running out. She had other family obligations today, but she set those aside to make the obligation that she has to the Lord, who is her Savior, to preach the gospel and harvest souls into the kingdom, more important than her own family obligations and more important than her own health problems. So That is a type or a picture or shadow of what the church is supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be preaching the gospel and teaching the word of God until the final trumpet blast, and then, boom, the church gets caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. Do I have scriptural support for that? Of course I do. And we're going to look at it right now. So we just looked at the the passages that relates to the red heifer. Then we looked at the passages in Leviticus chapter 23 that related to the feast of the Lord that's called Yom Teruah, or the feast of Rosh Hashanah, the day of the trumpet. Now let's go ahead and take a look at some of the passages that relate to. Let's go ahead and take a look at in the 7th month and the first day of the month of the Holy Convocation. Let's go ahead and take a look at any of the passages that could relate to the pre-tribulation rapture. And remember, because this teaching is what? The red heifers, Rosh Hashanah, and the rapture, and how they're all interrelated together. This is a confluence of Bible prophetic events that we have never seen before. When I gave this teaching last year, I was excited about Rosh Hashanah and the possibility that Yom Teruah could be the day that the pre-tribulation rapture of the church occurred. It didn't occur, and so Kim and I continued coming out, and Kim replaced Steve, and the work continues on. But this year, we now have something that we've never had before in my lifetime. We have red heifers that are ritualistically qualified to act as the temple purifier in the land of Israel, in the city of Jerusalem, this Rosh Hashanah, this Yom Teruah. We didn't have that last year, and we haven't had it for this Yom Kippur, this Yom Teruah, this Rosh Hashanah, the most significant one of our lifetimes. We've never had a red heifer in the land of Israel on Rosh Hashanah in any of our lifetimes. None of you out there in our viewing audience, I would be willing to bet, are more than 2,000 years old. So that means that this Rosh Hashanah, which begins tomorrow at sundown, will be the first Rosh Hashanah in any of our lifetimes, or any of the lifetimes of our parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents, where a red heifer existed in the land of Israel at the same time that the final trumpet blast of Yom Teruah, or Rosh Hashanah, was sounded. That will happen again Tuesday around noon here on the east coast of the United States, whether in Miami Beach or New York City, and at twilight in the land of Israel in Jerusalem. So we have exciting times. So what does the scripture say about, one, the building of the temple, or the rebuilding of the temple at this point, and the desecration of the Antichrist that also relates to the rapture? Let's go to Matthew chapter 24. In Matthew chapter 24, you have that very famous Bible prophecy, standalone diatribe that Jesus gave to the church world and to the nation of Israel at the same time. I believe he was addressing both the nation of Israel, the Jews, and the born-again Christians that would come along later afterwards, when he spoke on the Mount of Olives, and he said, Jesus went out and departed from the temple, Matthew 24, verse 1. And his disciples came to him and said, for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. So he predicted the destruction of the temple that stood in his day. But then he went ahead and he talked about the temple some more. So we know that there has to be, just like Jesus predicted some 3 decades before the temple was actually destroyed, it actually was destroyed. So we know, since that happened prophetically, the rebuilding of the temple that Jesus talked about in this same Bible prophecy seminar must also come to pass just as certainly. And so verse 3 of Matthew 24, and as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And then Jesus said, take heed that no man deceive you. And then he gives a bunch of signs. False messiahs, false Christianity, false believers in Christ saying that Jesus is Christ, but deceiving many. People claiming to be false Christ, and many people being led astray with what I believe is Jesus' prediction of the false Christianity that's predominant on the earth now. You have a lot of people that call themselves Christians. Jehovah's Witnesses, you've got over 1 billion Roman Catholics. They call themselves Christians. They don't believe anything that Jehovah's Witnesses believe. Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe anything that evangelical born-again Christians believe. So you've got a bunch of people using the rubric or term follower of Christ, but they believe disparate things. And so Jesus predicted that that would be the way things were when he came back for the church in the air at the rapture. And then 7 years later, Antichrist would be in the temple and he'd have to cast him out. So he goes on to say, verse 7, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There's going to be ethnic disputes and geopolitical national disputes. And people that are followers of Jesus Christ are going to be hated by everybody. So he didn't say that the followers of Jesus are going to get more and more popular until Christianity takes over the world, which is what your New Apostolic Reformation heretics teach, or the Kingdom Now supposedly Christians who are heretics teach. Christianity doesn't take over the world. No, Christianity rejects the world, and the world rejects Christianity to the extent that Jesus has to come into the earth and take his bride to be the church out of the world. Kim hit up a whole family of folks. Good job. So what we find out then is that if you're a true follower of Jesus Christ, you should find yourself less and less accepted and acceptable to the world. You should find yourself more and more rejected. If the world loves you more than it did 10 years ago, if you love the world more than you did 10 years ago, maybe you're in the wrong type of Christianity. Maybe you're not born again. Paul says, examine yourself whether you really be in the faith, because there are people that are sincere believers but have been deceived. And so Jesus predicted that false Christianity and false conversion in Matthew 24. And then he goes on to say, after saying you'll be hated of all nations for my sake, and that verse 11, false prophets shall arise and deceive many, and iniquity will abound, and the love of many will wax cold. Isn't that the way it is now? And then he says to the tribulation saints, he who endures to the end shall be saved. What that means is that after the Antichrist comes and after the pre-tribulation rapture of the church occurs, then the tribulation saints that are on the earth during the reign of the Antichrist, if they are able to fight the temptation to accept the Antichrist as their savior, then those people will be able to be saved if they endure to the end and refuse the mark of the beast. But the temptation to save their own lives will be great, and they will probably bow the knee to the Antichrist, take the mark of the beast, and then they will be condemned or damned, even if they believe in the biblical Jesus. Salvation by works is not the way Christianity or salvation works now. It's salvation by grace through faith alone. And so you can believe on the gospel of Jesus Christ and be saved without having to do any good works. That won't be the case after the rapture. After the rapture, you're going to have to do the good work of rejecting the mark of the beast and being willing to die for your faith in order to be saved. That's why Jesus says in verse 12, and because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. Verse 13, but he who endures till the end, the same shall be saved. But for the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, there is a different standard, and Jesus addresses them. But he goes on in verse 15 to talk to the tribulation saints, those left behind after the pre-tribulation rapture of the church. He says, to the nation of Israel, the vast majority of whom will be left behind after the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, when the Rosh Hashanah or Yom Teruah of the Bible is literally fulfilled. It says, verse 15, Matthew 24, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him who's on the housetops not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and them that give suck in those days. But pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world, to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. What Jesus is saying there is that after the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, Antichrist is going to enter in to the rebuilt temple, which can now be rebuilt within the next 6 months, because there's red heifers in the land of Israel for the first time in the last 2,000 years as of last week. Antichrist goes into the rebuilt temple, which could occur within 6 months, and declares himself to be God. And then God cuts short the time until the second coming of Christ and limits it to 1,260 days, because if he had let it go longer than 1,260 days, or 3.5 years, nobody left on earth would be alive, because the Antichrist would have killed them all. Do I have support for that? I do. And the support that I have for that clarifies a little bit the Antichrist abomination of desolation. Take a look at Daniel chapter 9, and let's go to verse 27. So let me go ahead and flip in my little Bible there. Flip the Bible there to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. And what we find out that it says there is that there's a prophecy related to the 69 weeks of Daniel. And in verses 24 through 26, we find out that there's several passages that relate to what occurs during the first 69 weeks, and then we get to the 70th week. Let's just go ahead and start in Daniel 9, verse 24. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. But before the anointing of the most holy and the messianic reign begins, verse 25 says, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, 62 weeks. In other words, 69 weeks of years, or 483 years, until Messiah shows up to die for the sins of the nation Israel and the sins of the world. That's what's laid out for you in Daniel chapter 9, verse 25. Then verse 26 says, and after the 62 weeks, or after the 69 weeks of years, or 483 years, shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And then it goes on to say, and the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of thereof shall be with the flood. Daniel is predicting that the temple is going to be destroyed by the same people that the Antichrist will eventually arise out of. We find out that that didn't occur until 70 AD. 70 AD, some, goodness forbid, 500 years later, the temple was destroyed by Titus Vespasian of the Romans. And so it is believed that the Antichrist in some way will be associated with the former Roman Empire, because the former Roman Empire is the one that destroyed that second temple that stood at the time of Jesus. But then we get to verse 27 of Daniel chapter 9, and it says this, and he, talking about the man of sin, the Antichrist, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. Remember, we know a week in this passage, in this context, is a unit of 7 years, a week of years, or a 7-year period of time. And he shall confirm a peace treaty or a covenant with many for 1 week or 7 years. And in the midst of the week, that is to say 3.5 years into the peace treaty, he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease. The temple will be up and operating as a functioning temple, which you need a red heifer to be able to do. We can do that now. It's going to be operating as the temple of God on Jerusalem, on the Temple Mount, for 3.5 years. Until Antichrist goes in, he's going to stop the sacrifice of the animals in the rebuilt temple that requires the red heifer to get started. And he's going to do something. He's going to cause the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even unto the time of the consummation, and that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. What was Jesus talking about? He was talking about Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. What was Daniel chapter 9, verse 27 talking about? It's kind of confusing. Well, if we flip over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, we get a little bit clearer picture of what Jesus was referring to in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15-ish, and Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. The abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet is clarified by Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 1 through 12. Let's start out. It says, now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and by our gathering together unto him. Those are two different comings. The first being the second coming in Revelation chapter 9, the return to the Mount of Olives physically. But our gathering together to him isn't anything to do with the earth. It means those of us that are believers on the earth getting gathered into the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, which we find that Paul wrote about in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 48 to 52, and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 to 18. But he's talking about both those comings, and then he goes on to say, but I'm talking about those things that ye be not soon shaken in mind or troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by letter, as if from us, as if the time of Christ is at hand. Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day, the day that the Antichrist is revealed and he goes into the temple to desecrate it, will not occur unless this happens first. Except there come a falling away first, and then the man of sin shall be revealed, the son of perdition. Falling away is the Greek word apostasia. It can mean a physical departure, but it can also mean a rhetorical, philosophical departure. So you have a double entendre. The word apostasia can mean that those that are believers or claim to be believers in Jesus Christ will depart from an orthodox understanding of the written word of God, the Bible, to a false system of beliefs that is also called Christianity. And then after that becomes very predominant, then the other literal meaning of apostasia or departure will occur, the physical apostasia or physical departure of real believers from in the midst of the false Christian believers who will be left behind after the rapture. So the real true born-again followers of Jesus Christ will be caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and the false believers in Jesus who have believed a lie and become part of churchianity or pseudo-Christianity will be left behind to face the wrath of the Antichrist. As soon as that rapture occurs and the real believers are gone from the world, then the man of sin, the son of perdition, can be revealed. And he goes on in verse 4, Paul writes, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God. 2 Thessalonians we're reading in. Who opposes and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, the Antichrist, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he, the Antichrist, is God. That's the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, that Jesus refers to in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15. The abomination of desolation is the Antichrist going into the rebuilt temple, which he's going to allow to be rebuilt probably, which is why the whole world, including the Jews, will probably accept him as the real Messiah, even though he's a false Messiah. But 3.5 years after he allows the temple sacrifice to begin, God bless you guys, he's going to go into the temple and say, no more sacrifices. There's a new religion, and I'm going to be the God of it. And I'm going to be worshipped as God. And the God of heaven is going to say, 3.5 years from today, that is to say 1,260 days from this very day, I'm going to send the real Messiah, Jesus Christ, back to the earth, to the Mount of Olives, to destroy the Antichrist and to establish the millennial reign of Christ on earth, or the Messianic golden age that all the Jews that believe in the Old Testament prophets of the Tanakh and the Torah, they are waiting for the Messianic age being introduced by a Messianic individual. And we were talking to our friend Ben, who's a Jew born in Jerusalem, earlier today, and he was saying, look, whoever is the guy that allows Israel to rebuild the temple very well is probably the Messiah. He didn't care if it was Jesus or whether it was somebody else. If they allow us to rebuild our temple and they bring peace amongst all the religions, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and otherwise, then I'd be prepared to accept them as the Messiah, is what our friend Ben said. And that's the same sort of thing that Jesus was teaching and Paul is teaching, and that's the same thing that's going to occur in real life. Maybe as soon as 6 months from now, the temple could be rebuilt, because there's now a red heifer in the land of Israel that can purify that temple. So what we see then is that the Antichrist will go into the temple, declare himself to be God. And then we find out that God will destroy the Antichrist. But before that time, he says, then that wicked shall be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and destroy with the brightness of his coming, even him, verse 9, whose coming is after the workings of Satan, with all power and signs and lying wonders, and all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they receive not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause, Kim, God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they all might be damned, who believed not the truth, which Kim is handing out in our gospel tracts, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. And that's kind of what Ben, our Jewish friend from Jerusalem, said earlier today. He said, look, if a guy shows up in Jerusalem and is powerful enough to rebuild the temple, and he can do signs and wonders, shoot, why wouldn't I accept him as the Messiah? And that's exactly the type of thing that Paul and Jesus warned about, and Daniel warned about 500 years before Jesus, that there's going to be a false Messiah who's going to use signs and wonders through the power of Satan to deceive the masses into thinking he's the real Messiah, but he'll be the false Messiah because he's going to go into the temple and declare himself to be God. Jesus is going to meet the church in the air. That's where we're going to meet him, not in some building, not in some religious building. And I have support for that in 3 pre-tribulation New Testament passages that I'm going to share with you now as we conclude our message for today. The first one we're going to look at is from the Last Supper. Jesus' last meeting with his disciples the night before the crucifixion was in John chapter 14, verses 1, 2, and 3. And in that passage you have Jesus saying this to his followers: "Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. For in my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. And I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, so that where I am, you may be also." That is a clear reference to the pre-tribulation rapture. That is clearly the very first reference to the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, and that is in the Last Supper passage. And most people ignore that. They don't understand that. And so Jesus told his disciples, "I'm going away to my Father's house of many mansions, but don't be sad, because when I'm finished preparing it for you, I'm going to come and receive you to myself." Where? In the clouds, to take you to the Father's house. Not on the Mount of Olives, not in the temple in Jerusalem. What support do I have for that? Well, we find that Paul clarified that even a little bit more when he wrote his first letter to the Corinthian church in verse 15. This is what he said, starting at verse 51. He said, "Behold, I show you a mystery," meaning something that you didn't really understand when Jesus first taught about it in John chapter 14, and when the prophet Isaiah first spoke about it in Isaiah chapter 26, verses 19 through 24 in the Old Testament. Nobody understood what he was talking about. What he was talking about was this: "Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep." And we know that sleep is what, Kim? What is it a euphemism for? It's a euphemism for physical death. But not all followers of Jesus are going to face physical death. Why? Because we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. What did I say, Kim? The last trump of Rosh Hashanah this year will occur Tuesday at about noon, Miami, New York City time. Is that the same last trump that Paul was talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 51, 52, and 53? Maybe. We'll find out Tuesday around noon. But maybe that's a type or a shadow or a picture. Either way, it is a type, picture, or shadow of the pre-tribulation rapture. He goes on to say, in a moment, in a twinkling of the eye, at the last trump, for the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall all be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible shall have put on incorruption, and this mortal shall have put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. That's why many believers in Jesus have drawn a correlation between the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Teruah, or what we call Rosh Hashanah in secular Judaism or secular Jewish life. Rosh Hashanah is associated with the rapture of the church because Paul says at the last trump, the rapture of the church will occur before the tribulation period that Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 24. Paul then went on to write a letter to the Thessalonian church, which is in my mind an even clearer recitation and statement related to the pre-tribulation rapture of the church. And that's what we're going to end on in hopes of seeing that fulfilled literally around noon on Tuesday, or maybe within months after that if the Lord is trying to trick us up a little bit and keep us on our toes. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. But again, Kim, because everybody is saying it can't occur on Rosh Hashanah this year because everybody's expecting it to, since everybody's expecting it not to because they think people are expecting it too, maybe the Lord will make it occur on Rosh Hashanah just to trick us up for not expecting it when we should have expected it, because he did say you should be watching it or watching for it. So maybe, like you said, instead of 12:01, maybe it'll be 11:58. Boom! Ah, surprise! You came a little bit early. So anyway, let's finish up 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Paul is writing to the Thessalonian church starting at verse 13, and he says this, "But I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren," he's talking to believers, "concerning them which are asleep," which Kim has already told us means have died physically. In other words, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, I don't want you to be depressed about your loved ones who died knowing Jesus Christ. Because, he goes on to say, "I don't want you to sorrow as others, that ye sorrow not even as others which have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so them which sleep in Jesus will God bring with him." That's a reference to the first fruits feast type shadow. Jesus is the first fruits of them that are going to rise from the dead permanently. And that again occurred several days after the Passover. Jesus rises the third day after the Passover from the dead permanently. He's the first fruits of the permanently resurrected, physically rising from the dead believers in Jesus Christ. So he goes on to say, "For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so them which also sleep in Jesus will God bring with him. For this we say unto you by the word of the Lord, that we which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Lord shall not prevent," that is to say, precede, "them which are asleep," that is to say, them which have died physically. Verse 16, "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of God." That's another reason why people associate Yom Teruah, the Feast of the Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, with the pre-tribulation rapture of the church, because both primary rapture passages from 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 verses 13 to 18 tie it into the blasting of a trumpet. And it says, "With the trump of God and the dead of Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord." The word "caught up" in that passage from verse 17 is the Greek word harpazo. That means a physical, violent, immediate snatching. It's not spiritual. It's not philosophical. It's a physical snatch. If I come over and snatch the gospel track out of Kim's hand or the cell phone out of her hand, that's the same way that the living church is going to be raptured or translated from the physical face of the planet Earth to the clouds above the earth, to eventually the Father's house outside the space-time continuum of outer space in our universe, to the third heaven. So Paul is telling us it is going to literally happen physically at the last trump. Is that last trump the same one that will occur Tuesday around noon here in Miami or in New York City? We won't know until we get there. But we know this, that the fifth of the 7 feasts of the Lord for Israel is the best archetype, picture, or shadow of a pre-tribulation rapture of the church. And this year, this Rosh Hashanah, which will begin tomorrow at sundown, will be the first one in the history of any of our lives to occur while there are red heifers alive on the earth in the city of Jerusalem here on the planet. That has never occurred in the history of our lifetime. It has not occurred in 2,000 years. There has not been a red heifer in Jerusalem on a Rosh Hashanah or a Feast of the Trumpets in 2,000 years. Tomorrow at sundown here in Miami Beach will initiate or begin the very first Rosh Hashanah ever in the history of our lives for the last 2,000 years, ever. A historic moment. Will it be followed 2 days later by the pre-tribulation rapture of the church? Only the Lord's hairdresser knows for sure, to spin on a commercial from back in the day. God knows for sure, but we don't. But Jesus does expect us to know the season or the time. Not the day and the hour. We don't know for sure, because in fact we don't even know when the sliver moon will appear in the sky in Jerusalem, which will cause the final blast of the trumpet to sound. They know within a few minutes when it should occur. They can't know the exact moment when it'll occur. And the same is true with the pre-tribulation rapture of the church. We know that we're in the season of the pre-tribulation rapture church. Why? Because we have red heifers in Jerusalem for the first time in 2,000 years. That alone tells us that we are in the season of the rapture of the church, but we also have all the other signs. False Christianity, false messiahs, false religion, a desire amongst people, including Jews, to have peace so strong that they'd be willing to accept anybody that can rebuild the temple and bring peace to the land of Israel, which is exactly what Paul was saying about the Antichrist. Somebody who is going to be so powerful that he allows the temple sacrifices to be rebuilt, despite the opposition of fundamentalist Islam or the Roman Catholic Church or any other religious paradigm that might compete against the interests of Judaism operating from a temple on the Temple Mount in Israel. That's a very important paradigm in the history of the planet Earth. And there are a number of people that would love to see that happen, and there's some other people that might be opposed to seeing that happen. But we know that it is going to happen because it must happen so that the Antichrist can go into that rebuilt temple and declare himself to be God, and 1,260 days later, the real Messiah, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, will return to the earth with his church, which has now become his bride, to take over the planet Earth and to rule and reign for 1,000 years in this space-time continuum and continuing on into eternity. So with that, we've ended it, and happy Rosh Hashanah, Day of the Trumpets, and the Feast of the Trumpets, which is coming, and we are prayerful that this will be the year that the Lord brings the church home to the Father's house in heaven and brings our season of sharing the gospel, the harvesting season of harvesting in souls into the Lord's storehouse, to a close. We enjoy doing it, but it's hard work, and we're glad to see it coming to a close. With that, we're ending it, and we are out of time. We've just hit the hour mark. Happy Rosh Hashanah, happy Yom Teruah, happy Feast of the Trumpets to all of you guys. God bless you guys. Like and subscribe, South Beach Gospel Ministry. And look for a series of our videos from today, Rosh Hashanah weekend, that are going to be uploaded throughout the day. Like and subscribe, make comments, and do all that kind of other stuff that social media algorithms really love to push us up and send us out to more pages. We've got new followers from South Africa, Australia, we've got people from Brazil, anticipating Pre-Tribulation Rapture church, hopefully, in final season, presence and glorious departure